Hey there, 8th graders, busy preparing for your exams. Need some help? Well, I am here with all your chapter summaries from Honeydew. So what are you waiting for? Go get started. You'll get to know about all the plots, themes, and characters from all your chapters. A great way to revise before your exams. All the very best. Have you ever wondered what a soldier at war would want as a Christmas present? Something to think about, right? Well, we'll find out in today's beautiful, beautiful story. But before we start the detailed summary of this story, I want you to take a look at this year on your screen. 1914, a very, very important year in world history. Why? Well, this was the year that World War I started. And in our story, we are actually looking at two different times. We're looking at the past, which happens in 1914, and we are looking at the present, which happens many years after 1914. We don't know exactly when, but we know that it's many years after 1914. And we explore the past, the incident that happens in the past, through a letter. Alright, and the time when that letter was written was specifically the time when British had declared war on Germany and British soldiers were fighting German soldiers. So war was in full swing. But then in December 1914, something miraculous happened, and that's what that letter is about. So we will read it shortly. Let's begin with our story. And our story begins with the narrator in a junk shop in this place called Bridport, where he found this very damaged roll-top desk, a very old damaged roll-top desk, but he was getting it for a very cheap price because of all the damage that was on it. So he decided to buy it and figured that he could fix it himself. And he noticed that there was a lot of fire and water damage on this desk. So remember, it's a very interesting fact about this desk that it had a lot of fire and water damage. So our narrator decided to take it home. And what day was this? This was Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve is the evening before Christmas Day. So on Christmas Eve, our narrator found this roll-top desk, decided to take it home and fix all the damage that was done to it. So our narrator goes home, decides to fix up the desk, and he's trying all sorts of things. So while trying to fix the desk, he accidentally finds a hidden secret drawer. Okay, and in that hidden secret drawer, he finds a tin box with something sellotaped on it. And what is it? It's a note. The note says Jim's last letter, received January 25th, 1915, to be buried with me when the time comes. Okay, so naturally, our narrator got curious and decided to open the tin box and read or see what's inside the box. So he found a letter dated December 26th, 1914. And the letter addressed to Mrs. Jim McPherson, 12 Copper Beaches, Bridport, Dorset. Alright, so we can see that the letter was received sometime in 1915, January 1915, was sent on December 26, 1914 and was addressed to Mrs. Jim McPherson from Bridport. Alright, so the letter started with Dearest Connie. Now, who do you think Connie is? Take a second to guess. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Jim McPherson and it started with Dearest Connie. So Connie is Mrs. Jim McPherson, right? So the writer of the letter was in the trenches when he was recounting something amazing that happened the day before. Alright, so let me quickly tell you what trenches are. So during the war, the soldiers hid in trenches, and these trenches were long, narrow ditches, and once the soldiers went into the trenches, the chances of them getting attacked by the enemy were minimized. So they could hide from the enemy. And these trenches were not comfortable places to be in. So it was a very hard time for the soldiers. So here in the letter, the writer of the letter was telling Connie about an incident that took place, and it was an amazing incident. So let's find out what that incident is. So here we are, 1914 December, in the middle of war. Jim McPherson was standing in the trenches with the rest of the soldiers, and it was Christmas morning. Soon he noticed a white flag being waved from the enemy side. So what does a white flag indicate? During wartime, if someone waves a white flag, it means they are either surrendering or they are saying that we do not intend to attack you. Alright, so then soon Jim McPherson, this person, the writer of the letter, saw that there is someone coming out from the other side waving a white flag, and people from his side started saying, don't shoot, because that person was waving a white flag. Now, who were the people on the other side? They were the Germans. And back in the day in World War I, people referred to German soldiers as Fritz and British soldiers as Tommy. So Fritz and Tommy, two common German and British names that were used to refer to soldiers. So British soldiers would call the German soldiers Fritz, and the German soldiers would call the British soldiers Tommy. So that morning, on Christmas morning in the trenches, the Fritz were calling out from the other side, "Happy Christmas, Tommy." And the British shouted back, "Same to you, Fritz." Alright. Then one of the Germans came out holding a bottle on his head saying, "It's Christmas Day, Tommy. We have schnapps. We have sausages. We meet you? Yes?" And then dozens of unarmed Germans started coming out of the trenches and walking towards the British. Now, little Private Morris was the first one to get up from the British side and say, "Come on, boys, what are we waiting for?" Alright, and here, so private is a rank. It's a military rank, and it's the lowest rank given to soldiers. Now, the writer of our letter, Jim McPherson, he was an officer, and he was supposed to stop everybody from mingling with the enemy side. But that thought didn't even cross Jim's mind, and he didn't say anything. And soon, surprisingly, the Germans and the Britishers started making peace in the middle of war. What an amazing thing, right? Then Jim met a German officer, and as you can see, they are shaking hands. So, "Hans Wolf," said the German officer, "I am from Dusseldorf. I play the cello in the orchestra. Happy Christmas." "Captain Jim McPherson," Jim replied, "and a happy Christmas to you too. I am a school teacher from Dorset in the west of England." Soon, Hans Wolf, the German officer, and Jim McPherson, English officer and writer of our letter, got to know each other, started talking to each other, and soon they realized that they actually had a lot in common. Hans Wolf loved this book, this novel called Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, which Jim McPherson also happened to like. And they sat and talked about the novel and all the different characters. Hans Wolf, the German officer, surprisingly spoke very good English, even though he had never been to England. And then Jim McPherson pulled out this cake, this Christmas cake that his wife had baked for him with marzipan on it. What is marzipan? Marzipan is this covering that is put on cake, and it's made of sugar, almonds and egg. And so he shared the marzipan cake with Hans Wolf, and Hans Wolf thought that it was the best marzipan he's ever had. So this is another thing Jim and Hans Wolf had in common. They both loved the marzipan that Jim's wife made. And then they had a lot more to talk about. They were both ordinary people who were forced to fight each other. And Hans Wolf had a wife and a 6-month-old son back at home. So, despite being enemies, they had all of these things in common and all of these different things to talk about. While they were all talking and saying Happy Christmas to each other, suddenly someone pulled out a football and all the soldiers started playing football. So they took off their coats, used them to make goal posts and started playing German soldiers versus British soldiers. And then Hans Wolf, the German officer, said something very nice. He said, I think this is how we should resolve this war. A football match. No one dies in a football match. No children are orphaned. No wives become widows. And that's a very deep and meaningful thing that Hans Wolf said. And Jim McPherson obviously agreed with him. And then the German soldiers won the football match, but Hans Wolf thought that the German soldiers had an unfair advantage because the British goalpost was a little wider than the German goalpost. Right? And then Hans and Jim bid each other farewell. Jim hoped that Hans would soon be able to see his family again and all this fighting and the war would end. I think this is what every soldier wants on both sides, said Hans Wolf. Hans saluted Jim and joined the many German soldiers walking back to the trenches. And then the British soldiers and the German soldiers spent the rest of the night singing Christmas carols. The Germans sang in German, the British sang in English, and miraculously, on Christmas Day, 2 sets of soldiers in the middle of a war stopped fighting, made peace with each other, called a truce. What is a truce? A truce is an agreement between 2 enemies to stop fighting. So the British soldiers and the German soldiers made a Christmas truce. So this is how Jim McPherson ended his letter. Dear Connie, by Christmas time next year, this war will be nothing but a distant and terrible memory. I know from all that happened today how much both armies long for peace. We shall be together again soon, I am sure of it. Your loving, Jim. So I'm sure you put 2 and 2 together that Mrs. Jim McPherson, Connie, is the officer Jim McPherson's wife. And Jim McPherson wrote in his letter that after the miraculous day he witnessed in the middle of war, he hoped that he would be with his wife next Christmas and that this war would become a distant and terrible memory. But do you think Jim McPherson actually came back to his wife next Christmas? Unfortunately, we saw on the tin box that this was the last letter that Connie received from her husband, and we can assume that Jim never made it out alive and was unfortunately killed during the war. So after reading this very emotional letter, our narrator realized that he needs to go to Bridport, he needs to find Connie and he needs to give this letter back to her. So the next morning on Christmas Day, the narrator made his way to Bridport and went to the address that was written on the letter. But when he reached that address, he saw that the house is completely burnt. And it's a burnt out shell of a house. That's how he described it. So he went around asking what happened and found out from a neighbor that Mrs. McPherson used to live in this house, but Unfortunately, when she got old, she became a little muddle-headed. That means she started losing her memory, became confused, and one day, probably because of lighting too many candles, her house burnt down. Thankfully, she made it out alive. She was rescued and sent to a nursing home. So a narrator found out the address of the nursing home in which Mrs. McPherson is and was sent to, and decides to make his way to the nursing home. And interestingly, Mrs. McPherson now is 101 years old. So this is how we know 1914 was long back, because Mrs. McPherson is very old now. Alright, so on the other side of town, our narrator goes to the nursing home to visit Mrs. McPherson. So once our narrator reached the nursing home, he found that it was all decorated and adorned with lights because it was Christmas Day. There he asked the matron about Mrs. McPherson. Who's a matron? Matron is a lady who takes care of everything in the nursing home. So he asked the matron about Mrs. McPherson, and the matron told him that Mrs. McPherson was not feeling too good today. She was a little confused, so she's not a part of the celebrations, but she would love to see you. This is what the matron said. She has no family, you know. No one visits. So I'm sure she'll be only too pleased to see you. So now we know that Mrs. McPherson had been really lonely throughout her life, had no family and no visitors. So the narrator went up to Mrs. McPherson, and there he said, "Happy Christmas, Connie. I found this. I think it's yours." So he gives the letter to Mrs. McPherson, and as soon as she gets the letter, her face lights up. She recognizes the letter and she starts gently stroking it. And then the narrator starts to explain how he found the letter, but Mrs. McPherson seemed to be lost in thought, just stroking the letter. Then suddenly Mrs. McPherson reached out and grabbed the narrator's hand and said, "You told me you'd come home by Christmas, dearest. And here you are. The best Christmas present in the world." So what happened here? Connie mistook the narrator for her husband. And what did she say? "You told me you'd come by Christmas, and here you are. The best Christmas present in the world." And then Mrs. McPherson continued to say, "I read your letter so often, Jim, every day. I wanted to hear your voice in my head. It always made me feel you were with me. And now you are here. Now you are. Now you're back. You can read it to me yourself. Would you do that for me, Jim dear? I just want to hear your voice again. I'd love that so much. And then perhaps we'll have some tea. I've made you a nice Christmas cake, marzipan all around. I know how much you love marzipan." Alright, so Connie tells the narrator, thinking that it is her husband, that when he was gone, she read the letter every day. It meant a lot to her, and while reading the letter, she felt like her husband's presence was around. And then she asked the narrator, thinking it was Jim, to read out the letter for her. And that's how our story ends. The story is from Andaman and Nicobar Archipelago. Now, before we get started, I want you to know the meaning of this word, archipelago. It means a group of islands, okay? So, let me write down the names of the stories that we will be discussing so you remember them. So, we are going to first discuss the story of Ignatius, and this happened in Katchal. Okay, Ignatius in Katchal. So what happened was that Ignatius was a manager of a cooperative society in Katchal, and his wife woke him up at 6 a.m. because she felt an earthquake. Okay, and when there's an earthquake, some of you might have experienced earthquakes. There are tremors. Tremors is the shaking that happens during an earthquake. So she felt tremors, and Ignatius perhaps thought it was just a regular earthquake. So we know in the story that before doing anything else, before leaving his house and going to a safe place, he makes sure to set his TV properly so that it doesn't fall and break. But because Ignatius and his family weren't aware that this was not just a regular earthquake and that a tsunami was coming, they weren't expecting it. They suddenly saw a wave rising, and the waves were so huge that they swept away his family, members of his family, basically his wife, his father-in-law, his brother-in-law, and two of his children. And the only children that managed to survive are the ones who were with Ignatius. So it is a very, very sad story. And I know as you must be reading it, you must be wondering, why are we reading such sad stories and of tragedies that happen to people? But just like positive stories are important, these stories are also important, especially when they are real, because we need to be aware of the pain and struggle that other people face so that we can become more empathetic individuals. All right, so that was the story of Ignatius. Then we move on to the story of Sanjeev. Here we have Sanjeev, who was a police officer, and he managed to save his wife and his baby from the tsunami. But because Sanjeev, perhaps because he was a police officer, was a courageous, brave person, he tried to rescue the guest house's cook's wife, and that is John's wife. And while doing so, he unfortunately, along with John's wife, got swept away by the waves. The third incident that we're going to learn about is that of Meghna. Sorry about that. Okay, we have Meghna. Now, Meghna is a 13-year-old girl, so she is someone who was of your age when this incident happened. And Meghna, again, was a sole survivor of her entire family. So she was swept away by the waves along with her parents, but then she found a wooden door to latch onto, which ended up saving her life because she floated in the sea on that wooden plank for 2 whole days. And then, even though she was saved, she lost all of her family, and to be floating in the sea with no help for 2 days is a very traumatizing experience. Traumatizing means something that has had such a negative impact on you that even remembering it is very difficult for you to handle. So she was traumatized by this, dazed by this, and in fact, she even saw rescue helicopters go above her twice, but they couldn't spot her. So that's why it took a longer time for the rescue operatives to save Meghna. A similar story is of Almas Javed. Okay, now Almas Javed is also someone close to your age, a 10-year-old girl, and her father actually noticed that the seawater was receding, and as the seawater was receding, he realized that this is a sign of a tsunami coming. And because of that, he warned everyone to take shelter. And because you cannot be prepared for such a situation beforehand, there was a lot of chaos in her family, during which her grandfather actually got injured, and then a huge wave came and Almas's grandfather was washed away. Slowly, her entire family was swept away. Almas managed to climb on a wooden log, and she fainted on the log. And then when she regained her consciousness, she found herself in a hospital in Kamorta. So the impact that this entire incident had on her made her not want to think about it or talk about it again and again. So both Meghna and Almas, rightfully so, were extremely traumatized by this experience. Very, very unfortunate, extremely sad to have to go through something like this. Then we have the stories from Thailand. Okay, that is part 2 of the chapter. Now, this story is on a more positive side because it tells us about presence of mind. It tells us about good decisions that were taken at the right time. And the protagonist of this story is Tilly Smith. Tilly Smith was a British schoolgirl, and she was with her family in Phuket in Thailand celebrating Christmas. And on 26 December 2004, while they were at the beach, she noticed something odd happening in the sea. She saw that the sea waves were slowly rising and there was foam that was beginning to form, and she also saw whirlpools. Okay, and everybody else at the beach, they weren't too concerned about this, but Tilly remembered something that she had learnt in school, and suddenly realized that the signs that she see are actually signs of a tsunami coming. So Tilly Smith at this point became hysterical. Hysterical means when your emotions become extremely uncontrolled, okay, and then you're giving all sorts of reactions and you're displaying really odd behavior because you cannot get hold of your emotions. So Tilly became hysterical and tried to convince everyone to go away from the beach because she had learned from a geography teacher that what's happening in the sea right now is a sign of a tsunami. Thankfully, her parents did not think that, Tilly is just a child and she doesn't know what she's talking about. They noticed that because she's behaving in such a way, something must be wrong and they need to listen to her, and they left the beach and went back to their hotel along with a lot of other people at the beach. Thankfully, their hotel could resist a few waves of the tsunami, because as soon as they reached there, the tsunami hit. They made it out right in time and were thankfully saved from what could have been or would have definitely been a situation that would have ended all of their lives. Okay? So, quick thinking, remembering what she learned in school, and her parents who got convinced, all these reasons led to Tilly Smith's and a lot of other people's lives being saved during the tsunami. All right. The next story that we're going to go over is not much of a story, more of an analysis of what happened, the sixth sense of animals in identifying disastrous natural calamities. So it was observed, especially at the Yala National Park. Where is this? This is in Sri Lanka. That the day the tsunami hit, 60 people, 60 visitors died, but barely any animal carcasses were found. I think only 2 animal carcasses were found. Carcass is a dead body. And in general, around 150,000 people lost their lives in a dozen of countries, but in comparison, only very few animals actually died. And another anecdote, another story that a person shared was a Sri Lankan gentleman who lived close to Gale coast, said that he used to take his 2 walks out on a walk on the beach every day. But the day that the tsunami was going to hit, they were very reluctant to go on a walk. They did not want to go, and that saved their lives. Okay? And even in the national park, it was observed that elephants were running away from the beach, and this was an hour before the tsunami struck. So all of this is evidence that maybe these animals are able to predict that something like a tsunami is going to hit, something like an earthquake is going to come. And there are 2 theories for this. One is that they have a sixth sense, that they just know this information. Another is related to their hearing. We already know that animals have a more acute sense of hearing than human beings. That means they can hear higher frequencies, a lot higher than the human range and a lot lower than the human range as well. So maybe the fact that they can hear very low frequencies gives them an indication that something is happening, maybe the movement of the earth, and that helps them predict the tremors of an earthquake. These are all I mean, this theory is rooted in science. It's related to the hearing. The sixth sense, not so much. It's just something that people believe that animals might possess a sixth sense that lets them know in advance when these things are happening. And all of these stories are evidence of that. With this, we have reached the end of the chapter. Just a little added information. You might have heard about people with epilepsy. They usually have dogs with them that are able to predict when their fit is about to come. So if you get questions that ask you about your opinion on whether animals have a sixth sense or which theory you identify with more, you can keep all of these added bits of information in mind while forming your opinion. And again, I know these are very sad, very depressing stories. We need to read them sensitively, and obviously our heart goes out to all the people who suffered and continue to suffer, because there are so many other natural disasters happening in the world. So just remember to be kind, to be empathetic, and to always be grateful that you and your family are safe and sound. We will be covering 100 years in very, very short sequences of events. So we are going to look at some key events that led to 1857, and as a lot of you know, 1857 was a very, very important year in our history. It was the first war of independence. So for all those of you who understand Hindi, glimpses could mean jhalak. So without further ado, let's get started with this chapter. And so, as a lot of you would have taken a look, those of you who haven't, please do. We have pictorial representations of all the events in this chapter. So it's sort of like a comic book, and there are speech bubbles in it. So you can see the characters represented in a picture, and all of them have speech bubbles. So they look sort of like this, or they can also be a box with their dialogues in it, right? So whatever the character is saying appears in the speech bubble. And through these pictures and speech bubbles, we are going to see what led to 1857, the first war of independence. And our journey starts here in 1757. Okay, and this is not a part of your chapter. For all those of you who are into history, you know that 1757 is the year when Battle of Plassey actually happened, and the East India Company took control of Bengal, and that's when they became an administrative power. So we are going to look at everything that happened after that. So here are the contents of your chapter. You have the martyrs, the company's conquest. So we'll go through all of this one by one. You can take a look at all of this on your screen. But do you know what the word martyr means? Let me give you a hint. In Hindi, we say shaheed. That's what martyr means. So martyr is somebody who gives up either something very important or usually, even their life for a cause. And in this case, the cause was freedom from British rule. Okay? So here we go. And obviously, credit where it's due. This is from Our Freedom Movement by S.D. Sawant. Alright. So let's start with the company's conquest, 1757 to 1849. Let's read what is there on your screen right now, and then we'll go into a little bit of explanation. So, with its superior weapons, the British East India Company extended its power in 18th century India. Some of East India's success at conquering India was due to the lack of unity between the many kings that ruled different parts of India at the time. So we all know that East India Company did not come as a ruler, as a power. It came as a business, a corporation. The East India Company wanted to trade in India, right? So they were all merchants, and India was known for its spices, its silks. So they thought they could make a profit in India. So that was the reason why they came. But after coming to India, they realized that first of all, India was not one nation as we know it today. It was ruled by different kings in different parts, and not all of these kings or rulers they weren't friends with each other. They didn't get along well with each other, and so that is what the East India Company sort of exploited to gain power in India. So the British East India Company had superior weapons, and a lot of kings had rivalries. Rivalries means they were competing with each other. They wanted to be more powerful than the other. And so they thought that they could use the East India Company's superior weapons or, their help to sort of gain power over each other. And with that, they unknowingly gave way to East India Company to become an administrative power and not just a corporation. And what does it mean to become an administrative power? It means you take the governance, the law, rules and regulations, everything in your hand. So all the citizens of that particular place have to listen to what you have to say. Okay, so it was due to the lack of unity between many kings that the East India Company gained control. Alright. Then moving on to the British rule. So like I told you, they came first as a corporation, slowly gained power and took control. So being merchants, the British wanted quick profits. Their heavy taxes forced farmers to abandon their fields. They also did not put any import duty on the goods manufactured in England when brought into India. Okay, so because they were a company, they understood that it was important for them to make profits. And with administrative control, they could figure out ways to increase that profit. And one way of doing that was imposing heavy taxes on farmers, which eventually led the farmers to abandon their fields because they couldn't afford to keep their fields and grow crops in it. Second thing that they did was import things from England, goods manufactured in England. So something that was manufactured in England was brought into India. And generally speaking, even today, when we import something from a different country, there are taxes on that. So the country that we are importing from will give us a good for a certain amount, and then we will add taxes to it, and that will become the final price of the good. So the final price of the good will be a lot higher. And two reasons why governments do that is because first, the government also needs income from the imported goods, and secondly, so that local manufacturers are not affected by imports, so that local manufacturers can continue to manufacture goods at a lower price, and people will prefer buying those goods and not just imported goods. This is why we say that imported goods are generally more expensive. That is because tax is added to those goods. But what did the East India Company do? East India Company did not put any import duty. Duty here means taxes. So, and because they did not put any import duty on the goods that came from England, then all the local goods that were produced were not bought by the people, and local manufacturers suffered because of this. All right. So these are the two things that the East India Company did to exert more power, and this is how it affected Indians. And here's a fact. So because local manufacturers were not able to sell their goods and make a livelihood, a lot of them eventually died of poverty and starvation. So between 1822 and 1836, 15 lakh Indians died of starvation. So, and all of this happened because of British policies. All right. Then, now here's something that's from your chapter. Anyone who crosses the seas loses his religion. So this is just a spiritual leader, guru, telling this to all his disciples. And another one is saying all the misery in the world is due to women. Now, what are these? These are backward, superstitious beliefs. What is a superstition? A superstition is something that everyone tends to believe, but there's no reason, there's no logic, there's no science behind that belief. So anyone who crosses the seas loses his religion. If you ask them how, there might not be a very logical answer to this, but people get scared and they believe this to be true. This is a superstition. And because of all these backward thoughts and superstitions that prevailed in India during that time, the British were able to exert more control over the population. Okay? And many religious leaders at that time preached these ideas, which led to a lot of problems in society. Okay, and some of the problematic things that happened were untouchability because of the caste system and child marriage. Alright, because women were thought to be the reason behind all the misery in the world. They were just married off at a very early age so that they're not exposed to the world, they don't do anything, they just sit at home, cook, clean, take care of the household. Okay, so that is all of these things. What do? Even today, so backward thinking, superstitious beliefs, they make the country weak, and that's what happened at that point of time as well, which led to the British again exploiting the entire situation and gaining more power. All right. So now here we have the mention of a very important figure from history. It's Ram Mohan Roy. A lot of you would know him as Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Okay, and this is happening from 1772 to 1833. And Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a learned man from Bengal, understood what was wrong with the country. So we all know that he was a social reformer. What is a social reformer? Person who brings about a change in society. So he tried to convince people not to have all of these backward thoughts and opinions, and tried to liberalize society, tried to bring more enlightened ideas into Indian society. So here's what he's saying. Let us not despise ourselves. Our ancient culture is great, and we are capable of greater achievements. We must first reform our society. Superstitions have been ruining us. How are superstitions ruining you? Let me give you an example. The East India Company crossed a sea to get to India. Right? They came all the way from England, crossed a sea, got to India, made such profits, ruled over India for 200 years. And they couldn't have done any of this if they believed that crossing the sea will make you lose your religion. So because a lot of Indians thought crossing the sea would make them lose their religion, they never explored the world outside. They just stayed where they are. This led to lack of exposure and lack of opportunities for them. Right? So this is an example how superstitions stop you from advancement. Okay, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy thought that we must first reform or change our society. And he gave an analogy. What is an analogy? An analogy is when you compare two different things that have a similar sort of meaning or implication. So he gave the analogy where cows are of different colors, but the color of their milk is the same. Different teachers have different opinions, but the essence of every religion is the same. Why did he say this? So first he compared how cows are all different, religious leaders and religions might all be different, but the milk from all the cows is the same. Similarly, the essence, the meaning of teaching of all the different religions remains the same. Okay, and he said this because there were rifts between the different religions, right? So there might have been people in all religions thinking that their religion is superior to the other. And Ram Mohan Roy thought that bringing Indians together, regardless of their religion, is very, very important. Because what did the British do? The British used divide and rule as their policy to gain control over India. Right? So Raja Ram Mohan Roy thought that if you could convince everybody that even though their religions might seem different, or their gurus might be telling them different things, the essence of every religion is the same, and we must understand that. Alright, so Ram Mohan Roy was also very attracted by science, and modern technology, modern knowledge, and he had started a newspaper, but the British got suspicious of him and stopped his newspaper in 1823. Okay. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy actually crossed the seas and went to England to see what made the British powerful. There he told them, "We accept you as rulers and you must accept us as subjects. But you must remember the responsibility a ruler owes to his subjects." Now it's important to note here, we know a lot of freedom fighters who came much later, like Bhagat Singh, Mahatma Gandhi, all of them did not want the Britishers as their rulers, right? But here early on, Raja Ram Mohan Roy actually said to the Britishers that we accept you as rulers and you must accept us as subjects. But remember the responsibility a ruler owes to his subjects. So just because you are a ruler does not mean you will exploit. It's your duty to take care of your subjects. Okay. Now here we have reached 1765 to 1835, and what was happening here? The oppression of Indians continued under the British rule. And it is important to note here that the British rule is still being exerted by the East India Company. Okay, so it's not officially the British Empire who's ruling, it's the East India Company that is still ruling. Okay, so in 1818 they had passed Regulation 3. Under it, an Indian could be jailed without trial in a court. Now, why is this important? You know that if somebody is accused of a crime, they first have a trial. What is a trial? They go to court, they defend themselves, they provide evidence for why they did not commit this crime, and then the judge takes a decision based on the evidence if the accused should actually go to jail or not. Okay? But in 1818, the British East India Company, the British rule, passed a regulation that said that Indians could be jailed without a trial. Now, what does this mean? This means that they could just simply arrest any Indian regardless of whether or not they have done anything wrong and throw them in jail. And there was no way for the Indian to defend him or herself. Okay, and this is a very oppressive rule. Okay, it was used to put Indians down. And another thing that sort of happened at that time was that all British officers that worked for the company, they drew really big salaries and they got very, very rich. So this was the best job you could have at that time. Going to India meant making loads and loads of money. And meanwhile, Indians were losing their businesses, they were losing their jobs, they were suffering and they were becoming poorer and poorer. Alright, so in 1829, Britain was exporting British goods worth 7 crore rupees to India. Okay, so in 1829, Britain was already exporting British goods worth 7 crore rupees. So understand the magnitude of the kind of profits that the East India Company was making versus what was happening to the Indians. Now here, Governor General Bentinck reported back home, the bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. Bleaching means something that turns white because it's exposed to light. So the bones were bleaching on the plains of India. Whose bones? The cotton weavers' bones. Because cotton weavers had lost their livelihoods because textiles were all imported from Britain. So this statement over here, it was made by Sir William Bentinck. He was the Governor General of India in 1834, from 1834 to 1835. And this highlights what Indians were actually going through at that time. And all of this happened because of all the policies that the British made, which led to the destruction of Indian industries. Okay. And obviously everything, so in India you had a lot of artisans working with hand, they were producing handicrafts, and Britain at that time had already mechanized a lot of their processes. So most of their goods were machine made, so they were easier to make, they took less time to make, and they were mass produced, and all of this was shipped over to India, and Indian artisans lost their jobs. Now 1835 to 1856, what is happening? Dissatisfaction. English education produced clerks to whom the British gave petty jobs under them. Incidentally, it also produced a generation of intellectuals. So prior to this, education in India was mostly through the means of either Sanskrit or Persian. And in 1835, an Englishman named Macaulay suggested a change. He said we should start teaching the natives, we should start teaching the Indians in English. Alright, and what this did is it produced a lot of clerks who could do all the petty jobs that Britishers thought were beneath them. So all the very boring sort of work that took too much time and was not that important but had to be done, like filling out some paperwork and all of that, they said that we should just teach all the Indians how to read and write and speak in English, and they can take care of all these jobs and we could do more important things. But what this also did was that it gave birth to a new generation of intellectuals. Alright, people like Rabindranath Tagore and even Rajaram Mohan Roy for that matter, once they were exposed to the world of English, they understood a lot of things better, and they understood the psyche of the British. So the people that they were trying to sort of fight against, they understood the way they functioned a lot better by learning their language. And here's what they started saying. We must educate our brothers and try to improve their material conditions. For that, we must convey our grievances to the British Parliament. What are grievances? Grievances are complaints. Okay. Now here's 1855 to 1857, the sparks. So taxes continued to ruin the peasants. In Bengal, the Santals, who had lost their lands under new land rules, became desperate. In 1855, they rose in rebellion and massacred Europeans and their supporters alike. What is massacred? Massacred is killed. So because the Santals had lost their lands because of the new oppressive land rules, they rose in rebellion, got together and killed the Europeans and all the supporters of the Europeans. And these were the sparks that eventually manifested in 1857. So discontent was brewing in the East India Company's army too. Alright, and this is very important. So what happened? In the East India Company army, you had British people, British soldiers and British officers in higher ranks. Okay, they were well respected, drew nice big salaries, and then they also recruited some Indians who were just sepoys. Sepoys was a term used for all the Indians working for the British or the European army, and the sepoys were obviously not treated well, not given a very nice good salary, and did not get to live in mansions with servants around them. Right? So all of this, they were doing equal amount of work, if not more, but they were not getting to reap the benefits. So while we get a pittance and slow promotions, what is a pittance? Just very, very low salary, barely enough for them to survive, and slow promotions. Okay. So the Angrez asks us to cross the sea, which is against our religion. Who is the Topiwala to abolish our age-old customs? So what was happening? The Britishers were asking Indians to do things that they were not comfortable doing because of their age-old traditions and customs, and this made them angry. So here they are saying we must drive out the Angrez. So thousands and thousands of sepoys actually started sharing these emotions and revolted against the British. And there was one special sepoy worth mentioning, Mangal Pandey. A lot of you must have heard of him because there was a movie made on Mangal Pandey. So Mangal Pandey actually attacked the adjutant of his regiment and was executed. So the adjutant is just a military officer who takes care of administrative matters, and a regiment is a huge group of soldiers that is comes under a single colonel. Okay, so he killed the adjutant. It's a very confusing word to say. Adjutant of his regiment, and was actually executed. So few Englishmen had cared to understand Indian customs or the people's mind. The Britishers didn't care enough to understand Indians. They thought that Indians were beneath them, that they were the superior race, and it was their duty to civilize all of the Indians. So they did not care about Indian customs or how the people thought. And this made the people angry. And one very important thing that happened was that the bullets that the Indian sepoys were supposed to use, and how they would use the bullets is they would bite off the casing. And so the grease on that bullet that they had to bite was actually made from the fat of cows and pigs. Now we all know that Brahmins do not eat meat, and cows are actually sacred to them, and it is also against the Muslims also don't eat pork, or they don't eat the meat of pigs. And so this actually went against both Hindus, Brahmins and Muslims. This was something that offended both of them, because the grease on the bullets was made from the fat of cows and pigs. Alright, so here you have the Brahmin saying, what? And a Muslim man also saying that the white man has deceived us too. Okay? And so because of all of these things, distrust was rising. And soon what happened was that chapatis were being made with secret messages inside, and these were sent from village to village to tell people that we all now need to come together and fight against the British. Okay, and who started this movement? It was the Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. So people were told through these secret messages in their chapatis or rotis that the emperor would require their services. So they united to give their support to their kings. So this was also known actually as the chapati movement. And similarly, lotus flowers were circulated among Indian soldiers, and the masses gave all help and shelter to the patriots. So even if common people were not willing to actually raise arms and fight, they were protecting and helping all the patriots who actually wanted to go ahead and rise against the British. And finally, this led to the revolt of 1857, First War of Independence. Everybody united under Bahadur Shah Zafar, and there was a violent outbreak in Meerut. Sepoys from Meerut marched to Delhi. The rebellion kept spreading, and many other people started joining in. And apart from the peasants who lost their life and died of starvation, and all the cotton weavers who lost their livelihood, many landlords were also very angry because they lost their lands because of new oppressive British land rules. Okay? And so they also got angry, they were sore, they joined the unrest. So many rulers, former rulers who had lost their kingdoms also joined the unrest. So there were people like Begum Hazrat Mahal of Lucknow, and popular leaders. There was Maulvi Ahmadullah of Faizabad. He actually told a lot of people to rise up against the British, convinced a lot of people who looked up to him to join the revolt. And people rose everywhere, in Bareilly, in Kanpur, in Allahabad. And here the Maulvi Ahmadullah is a name that you should remember. Maulvi Ahmadullah of Faizabad was a very key person in getting people to gather and rise against the British. So then the fight for freedom happened. Azimullah Khan told Tatya Top, we should have Peshwa Nana Sahib as our leader in this war of independence. So the patriots pounced upon the British and fought pitched battles all over North India. Peshwa Nana Sahib was a Maratha leader, and so Azimullah Khan was his secretary and then prime minister. So they all made Nana Sahib their leader in the war of independence. And here we have an incident. 80-year-old Kunwar Singh of Bihar received a bullet in his wrist. And he said, Mother Ganga, this is my last offering to you. So people gave up their lives to fight against the company. And there was a pitched battle. There were many pitched battles actually all over North India. Okay, and this came to be later known as the First War of Independence. This was the first actual uprising against the British rule. And with that, our lesson ends. So our lesson ends with 1857, the first war of independence. But a lot of you know that that is not when India gained its independence. It took 90 more years of fighting against the British. And interestingly enough, like I told you, till 1857, it was actually the East India Company that was ruling on behalf of the British Crown. But after this revolt of 1857, the British Empire actually officially took over. There was the Government of India Act, and 1858 onwards, the British Empire was directly ruling over India. And then a lot more freedom fighters came about, a lot more battles were fought, and finally India gained independence in 1947. So, you must be knowing about a lot of other freedom fighters and important events that happened during this time. So do think about all of those events. For example, you can make the connection between the Swadeshi movement and what was happening. So why did Gandhiji say that we need to start producing our own khadi cloth and say no to British imported textiles? So all of these are things that you can make connections with and think about. So here, now lapse of memory is a part of, is a part of the name of your chapter. And yes, so lapse by itself means a mistake that you make because you forget something. But a lapse of memory means forgetting something important. So as you can see, a period of time when a person forgets things that he or she should have remembered. Okay? And just for your information, because this story it has been translated, you might find this with different titles and names in different places. But in our textbook, it's Bipin Chaudhary's Lapse of Memory. So it's important to understand what lapse of memory means. Alright, so it's forgetting something that one should have remembered, and this can be for a period of time. Okay, so and this might happen to a lot of us. We generally forget things like people's birthdays. I have forgotten people's names, the people that I've met only briefly, and we forget where we've kept something. Maybe we enter a room and we forget why we've entered that room. So such lapses of memory are common, they happen. But would you ever forget something very, very important in your life, like maybe a trip that you took with your family somewhere? That's very unlikely, right? We usually don't forget such things. So in this chapter, Bipin Chaudhary does have some trouble with his memory, and he seems to have forgotten an entire trip to Ranchi, which is very, very unlikely for him. So let's get into it and see why this happened. Was Bipin Chaudhary losing his mind? Was he, slowly going crazy? What was going on? All right, let's find out. So this chapter is divided into 4 parts in your textbook. So we're going to go accordingly. So let's begin with part 1. Okay, now here, when the chapter begins by telling us what Bipin Chaudhary usually did every Monday. So every Monday after work, Bipin Chaudhary or Bipin Babu made a trip to New Market, to this place called Kali Charan's, where he bought books. And the author tells us that Bipin Chaudhary loved reading. He was not a very extroverted, friendly kind of a person. He didn't usually mix around a lot, did not have a lot of friends, and lived alone, and thoroughly enjoyed reading. So he needed at least 5 books to get him through the week. So on Monday, he was getting all the books that he needed to fill his quota for the week. So Bipin Babu, the main character of our story, entered a bookstore that he frequently visited, and there, as he was going about his business, a man approached him, and as you can see, saying, "I don't suppose you recognize me." Alright, and so this was supposedly an old acquaintance of Bipin Babu, Parimal Ghosh. And Parimal Ghosh claimed that he knew Bipin Babu from Bipin Babu's Ranchi trip. Now, that this confused Bipin Babu. Bipin Babu was like, "I've never been to Ranchi before. What do you mean I know you from my Ranchi trip?" And chose not to believe Parimal Ghosh. He assumed that this is just some random person messing with him. And so he chose to ignore Parimal Ghosh. But then Parimal Ghosh started giving Bipin Babu more details. And he said, do you not remember this trip you took to Ranchi in 1958? You were there with another one of your friends. We even went to Honeydew Falls. And this started confusing Bipin Babu quite a bit. Alright? So, there we go. At first, Bipin Babu says, have we met before? Do I know who you are? And Parimal Ghosh says, we met every day for a whole week. I arranged for a car to take you to the Honeydew Falls in 1958 in Ranchi. My name is Parimal Ghosh. Now, what's the shocking bit here? Bipin Babu had no memory of this so-called trip to Ranchi. Then, when Bipin Babu continued to deny that, no, I've never been to Ranchi, Parimal Ghosh started giving him a lot of personal information. He said, don't you remember that we sat and talked and you told me that you do not have any kids? You told me that your wife passed away years ago and that you lived alone and that you had a brother who was in an insane asylum, and which is the reason why you don't want to visit the asylum in Ranchi. So this is a lot of personal information for some random person to have about you, right? So this really confused Bipin Babu. He was taken aback, and then he was like, you know what, still, you're making a mistake. One often does. I've never been to Ranchi. So Bipin Babu was convinced that he had never been to Ranchi. Now, this man, Parimal Ghosh, says, what are you saying, Mr. Chaudhary? You had a fall in Honeydew and cut your right knee. Alright, and then he also said that a man called Dinesh Mukherjee was also there on the same trip with you. Now, Dinesh Mukherjee was a man that Bipin Babu knew. So, this random person, Parimal Ghosh, is giving Bipin Babu all of this information that is true, except for the fact that Bipin Babu claims that he had never been to Ranchi. Okay, so Bipin Babu ignored this man and went about his life as usual. Okay, and with that, we get to part 2 of the story. So, essentially what happens in part 1 is that Bipin Babu, who loved reading, was just going about his day when a random man called Parimal Ghosh claimed to have known him from Bipin's trip to Ranchi. Okay, now here we are. So, at first, Bipin Babu chose to ignore whatever happened and thought it was just a mistake that some person is making. But then when he continued to think about it, and it continued to bother him. And soon Bipin Babu thought that he was losing his mind. How could he not remember having been to Ranchi? Okay, and he could not. The one thing that stuck with him was, how did he know all of this personal information about me? So he chose to check if he actually had a cut on his right knee. And when Bipin Babu checked, he did have a cut there. Now, he could not remember how he got it. Maybe he fell as a child and got the cut. Who knows? But why did this random person at the bookstore know that he had a cut? So if he had never been to Ranchi, if he had never actually visited the Honeydew Falls and never actually fallen there, how did he end up getting a cut on his right knee? Okay, so even the next day, he could not stop thinking about this, and finally he was like, should I maybe call Dinesh Mukherjee and check if we actually did go to Ranchi? But then he also doubted himself there, thinking that if I call Dinesh Mukherjee, then Dinesh Mukherjee might think that I've gone crazy. Now here, it is important to understand, and the author does this in the story, that Bipin Babu was a very intelligent, conscientious man, and he had an impeccable memory. And there are many instances in the story, and we'll look at them. So it's just important for you to remember that Bipin Babu's character has been portrayed in such a way that he was very fond of reading. If he could go through 5 books in a matter of a week, that truly meant that his brain, his mind was in a great state. So this particularly really bothered him, because if you think that your brain is working perfectly and then all of a sudden an incident like this happens, it will really throw you off. So that's essentially what happened with Bipin Babu. Okay, but then he did, so in order to confirm and find out what's going on, Bipin Babu did eventually call Dinesh Mukherjee, and Dinesh Mukherjee confirmed that they had gone to Ranchi in 58. So now that's two people claiming that Bipin Babu was in fact in Ranchi in 1958. Now, Bipin Babu could not digest the fact that he could forget an entire trip that he took, and it was not that long ago. Maybe I think it mentioned 6 or 7 years ago, right? So Bipin Babu had an excellent memory, but he somehow forgot an entire trip to Ranchi. That concludes part 2 of the story. Now, moving on to part 3. So, Bipin Babu, there's a bit where the author, Satyajit Ray, explains that Bipin Babu was working for this one organization where he had a very responsible job. So he was going to office every day. In fact, he had just conducted a meeting where he spoke for half an hour and nothing had ever gone wrong at work. Okay, so if Bipin Babu had something seriously wrong with his brain, why had nothing gone wrong during his work all this while, right? But Bipin Babu simply could not shake off the fact that he couldn't remember going to Ranchi, which obviously is very shocking, would be for anybody. And now, so here we get introduced to a new character. This character is Chunilal. So Bipin Babu, sitting at home wondering what's wrong with him, gets a visit from Chunilal. And here we find out that this person, Chunilal, went to school with Bipin Babu, and he was struggling in the recent past. He needed a job and he kept reaching out to Bipin Babu for a job. But Bipin Babu denied. I mean, he did not help him out, and he kept saying that I can't do anything for you, and started ignoring Chunilal. So while Bipin Babu was busy thinking about what's wrong with his mind, Chunilal showed up at his house again. Now, every time Chunilal showed up, Bipin Babu followed the same protocol. He asked his servant to tell him that he's busy, he's not available, and he can't meet him right now. So he asked his servant to do the same thing. But then suddenly he realized, okay, I have known Chunilal for a long time. Maybe he will be able to confirm if I have been to Ranchi or not. So Bipin Babu meets Chunilal and then asks him, hey, do you remember what I was doing in 58? Did I make a trip to Ranchi? Now here, Chunilal says, I was a travel agent at that time, and in fact I was the one who booked your tickets to Ranchi and planned the entire trip out for you. I dropped you off to the station. Something in your compartment was not working and I fixed it for you. And of course I remember that you went to Ranchi in 58. How could you forget? So now this is the third person who has confirmed that Bipin Babu indeed made a trip to Ranchi in 58. And Chunilal was actually quite shocked that Bipin Babu did not remember going to Ranchi in 58. And now this really threw Bipin Babu off, right? So here we can see that conversation. You're sure that I did go to Ranchi? Do you mean you have doubts about having gone at all? No, so Chunilal is shocked. You're like, are you really doubting yourself? Of course you went to Ranchi. Okay. So now Bipin Babu seriously starts doubting himself, and as he gets extremely worried, he decides to go visit a doctor. So Bipin Babu went to a doctor called Paresh Chanda and explained his situation to him, and the doctor said, okay, this is very weird. I've never come across a case like this before, that you remember everything else but have specifically forgotten this one trip that you made to Ranchi. So the doctor said that I've never dealt with anything like this before, so I wouldn't know exactly what to do. But I think that if you were to go back to Ranchi, maybe seeing the place will help you remember that you had actually been there before. Okay, so now this seemed like a good idea. So Bipin Babu decided to book a first-class ticket and make a trip to Ranchi. And here we are in the final part of the story. So far it's quite odd that a man with such impeccable memory who's still reading and working a responsible job has completely forgotten a trip that he took. So now let's see what actually happened. So Bipin finally visited Ranchi in the hope that he will be able to remember his trip from 58. But as soon as he got out of the train, nothing seemed familiar. So if you revisit a place that you visited before, you'll know where certain things are, you'll know what the city looks like. So Bipin Babu had no memory of ever having visited this city. Everything seemed strange and as if he was seeing it for the very, very first time. So soon Bipin Babu gave up hope. He said, okay, I've gone crazy. This is it. But then he decides to maybe make a trip to Hundru Falls. Going to Hundru Falls might help him remember falling and getting a cut on his knee and whatnot. So he decides that, okay, I've come all the way here. Let me try this out as well. And he takes his trip to Hundru Falls as his final shot. And then what do we see in the story? We see that Bipin Babu fainted in Hundru Falls. Now, we don't exactly know why he fainted. There is no explicit reason given for it, but we just know that he faints. Some Gujarati tourists help him, and the first thing he says after regaining consciousness is, that's it, or I've lost all hope now. Something along those lines. So we know that Bipin Babu is now convinced that he has lost his mind. So Bipin Babu comes back to Calcutta, and because he fell and fainted in Hundru Falls, he actually injured himself quite badly. So he decides to call Dr. Chanda and say that, I couldn't remember anything, I've lost my mind, plus I've injured myself. And Bipin Babu was just panicking when his servant came up to him and gave him a letter. Okay, so just before the doctor arrived, Bipin Babu called the doctor. Just before the doctor arrived, the Bipin Babu's servant gave him a letter. Okay, and the letter was marked urgent and confidential. So confidential means it's a secret. No one else should be reading this, just for you. So urgent and confidential. And so Bipin Babu opened the letter and he read it. Now let's read what the letter said together. Okay, dear Bipin, I had no idea that affluence would bring about the kind of change in you that it has done. Was it so difficult for you to help out an old friend down on his luck? I have no money, so my resources are limited. What I have is imagination, a part of which I used in retribution of your unfeeling behavior. Well, you'll be all right again now. A novel I've written is being considered by a publisher. If he likes it enough, it'll see me through the next few months. Yours, Chunilal. Alright, so what actually happened here? Chunilal, and here let's go through a few meanings first to understand. Affluence means because Bipin Babu is doing so well, he had a nice job, he had money, he had luxury. So affluence means having having more than what is required. So having a lot of money, a lot of luxuries in life. And then we have retribution over here, which means punishment. Retribution means punishment. Okay. And unfeeling behavior means not because Bipin did not help out Chunilal. Unfeeling behavior here means not having sympathy or empathy for your friend who is in need, or not feeling bad for your friend who requires your help. Alright, so it was actually Chunilal who had been reaching out to Bipin Babu for so long for a job that Bipin Babu could have easily helped Chunilal out, but he refused to do that. And now this was Chunilal's way of either getting revenge or giving. The Chunilal uses the word retribution, but here in some way Chunilal justifies this as giving Bipin Babu a taste of his own medicine or just punishing him for not being there as a friend for Chunilal. Alright, and so everything that Bipin Babu went through was actually a setup, a trap or a prank that Chunilal came up with. So Chunilal was the one who sent Parimal Ghosh. Chunilal has known Bipin Babu ever since they were in school. So he obviously knew all these personal details about his life. And Chunilal also probably called up Dinesh Mukherjee and asked him to confirm that or lie that they had gone to Ranchi in 58. Alright, so now we know that Bipin Babu didn't actually forget, but he was made to believe like he had forgotten. And because we know, the author sets up a character sketch or tells us exactly what kind of a person Bipin Babu was. And we know that he loved, like we've gone through this so many times now, he loved reading. He was very good at his job, and in general he was just very proud of his brain, the way it functioned, and his memory. So Chunilal attacked him right where he knew it would hurt. Alright, so then right after reading the letter, the doctor arrived, and what does Bipin Babu do? Bipin Babu told the doctor that, you know, you were right. As soon as I went to Ranchi, I remembered that I'd been there before and everything just came back to me. So Bipin Babu lied to the doctor and then said, but you know, the reason why I've called you is because I fell in Undru Falls and now I need painkillers for the pain. So the author doesn't exactly tell us how Bipin Babu felt after reading the letter. The author doesn't tell us the reaction of Bipin Babu right after reading the letter, but just tells us what Bipin Babu said to the doctor. So now it is up to us to infer or assume what Bipin Babu must have felt. And that brings us to the end of our story. So in the end, we find out that all of this was a prank done by Chunilal because Bipin Babu refused to help him out. So that's all. That's the summary and analysis of this chapter about climbing the Mount Everest. So before we hear his story in his words, let's get to know the meaning of these two words. It's very important for a better understanding. Summit and within. Now, summit is the highest point of a mountain. So literally the highest point of a mountain is a summit. But in our chapter, the word summit is also being used metaphorically to refer to the highest point that a human being can reach within themselves. Now within means inside. Okay, so the summit within means the highest point of understanding that you can reach in yourself. Okay, so let's get to know how Mr. Ahluwalia draws this parallel between climbing a mountain and reaching the highest point of understanding within ourselves. So the chapter starts with Mr. Ahluwalia explaining how he felt when he reached the summit of Mount Everest. And he said in the beginning that obviously there were a mix of emotions. He felt a lot of very different things, but the overwhelming emotion at this point was humility. Alright, now humility means not feeling proud, and actually reaching to the top of the Mount Everest is a huge accomplishment and should make anyone feel very, very proud. But on the contrary, he felt humbled. He felt humility by seeing how small he is in this universe. Alright, and he said that even though he was extremely happy, he also felt a tinge of sadness. And why did he feel that tinge of sadness? It was because he had accomplished perhaps the most difficult thing to achieve, and now there's nothing bigger for him to accomplish. All roads will now lead downwards. Alright, so let's read what's written here. By climbing the summit of Everest, you are overwhelmed by a deep sense of joy and thankfulness. It is a joy which lasts a lifetime. The experience changes you completely. The man who has been to the mountains is never the same again. Alright, so by climbing to literally the highest point of the tallest mountain, you are overwhelmed by a deep sense of joy and thankfulness. So, and this joy lasts a lifetime. So after you have accomplished something as huge as this, you are never the same again. You're a changed person forever. This is what he is trying to tell us. All right. So now the next question is, why did Mr. Ahluwalia want to climb a mountain in the first place? Why did this thought enter his mind? And he said a lot of things. He said that, he's always been fascinated with mountains. Ever since he was a child, he loved mountains, and not being around mountains actually made him sad. And he thought that mountains were just the most beautiful thing in the world. And he also believed, and now this is very important because this is what connects climbing a mountain to the summit within. He said that I believe that mountains are a means of communion with God. Now, communion means feeling a relationship with God. Alright, so he goes on to say that if you were to ask anybody who's climbed a mountain why they climbed the mountain, the simple answer would be because it's there. And it's human tendency to want to overcome obstacles, right? So we do overcome a lot of obstacles in life, and when we achieve something, when we work hard towards something and we achieve it, we feel a lot better about ourselves, and we feel a greater sense of purpose, in the world. So that is a simple answer for anybody who wants to climb a mountain. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And if you actually do it, you're proving something not just to yourself, but to everybody around. So you become a source of inspiration, and you get to know your own limits, what you are capable of. So that is a simple answer to this question. But Mr. Ahluwalia said that he had a more personal answer to this question. He had always been fascinated with mountains, and he believed that mountains are a means of forming a relationship with God. So he had a more spiritual, more emotional reason to climb the mountain, and not just a physical reason to climb the mountain. So the beauty and majesty of a mountain posed a great challenge to him, and overcoming that challenge did not just mean proving that you're very physically capable, but also you have the emotional and spiritual strength to achieve something like this. And this is more about what we just discussed. So Everest is not just a physical climb. The man who has been to the mountaintop becomes conscious in a special manner of his own smallness in this large universe. Alright, so now if you ask the question, why Everest out of all mountains, then Everest is the highest, the mightiest, and the most challenging and difficult mountain to climb. Right, so it's a constant war against rock and ice, and it's such a tiring and overwhelming journey, and at multiple points you think, this is it, I'm going to give up now. But then you somehow overcome that feeling of giving up and keep at it. So all of this, Mr. Ahluwalia also explained throughout the chapter that there are multiple points during the climb where you feel like it's just easier to go back down than to keep going up. It seems endless. Alright, but then you overcome that emotion in that moment and you keep going, and everything becomes worth it when you reach the summit and you see the expanse, the panorama in front of you, and you truly realize how small you are in this universe, right? So, and this is what he's saying here. You become conscious, you become aware in a special manner of your own smallness in this large universe. So just the mountain itself, it's such a high, majestic, big structure, and It takes you so much effort to climb it, and then you realize how small you are compared to this mighty mountain that exists, and so how small you are compared to the world and the universe that exists around you. Okay? He also, a very important point to bring up here is that he also said that there is no actual final answer to why he climbed the Mount Everest. And it's like asking someone, why do you breathe, or why do you help your neighbor? There's no one final answer. It just feels like the right thing to do. And that's how he felt about climbing the Mount Everest. All right. So now here we make the connect between climbing the Mount Everest and climbing up your own inner self. So the mountain that is within you, so your own summit. There's another summit. It is within yourself. It is in your mind. Each man carries within himself his own mountain peak. He must climb it to reach to a fuller knowledge of himself. Okay? So this is the spiritual angle of climbing a mountain. So we human beings tend to draw comparisons between a lot of things that they experience physically to a lot of things that they feel or experience emotionally. So just like a huge mountain in front of you is a big obstacle, oftentimes in life things can feel like a big obstacle. Sometimes your exams can feel like a big obstacle. Sometimes failure can feel like a big obstacle. There are just multiple things that sometimes do not work in our favor. And having the strength, the willpower, the endurance, the persistence. Now these are all words that Mr. Ahluwalia used to describe climbing a mountain, that you need endurance. Endurance is the ability to keep trying to do something despite feeling pain, and then persistence, which is the ability to do something despite everything going against you, and willpower. So endurance, persistence and willpower is needed to climb a mountain. Similarly, all these things are needed to actually overcome obstacles in your own life. So obstacles in your life are like a mountain, and the more you overcome them, the more you see that you need to keep at it, you will reach the summit, which is the highest point of understanding within yourself, where you can have a view. Just like if you reach the summit of a mountain and you look below you and you have this entire view, uninterrupted view of everything that is below you. Similarly, if you reach the highest point of understanding within yourself, you will have a view of your entire life from a better perspective, and you'll be able to understand things better. You won't feel sadness, guilt, regret, and all of these negative emotions that we sometimes tend to feel, right? So each man carries within himself his own mountain peak. He must climb it to reach to a fuller knowledge of himself. Okay, and just like other mountaineers while climbing a mountain help each other out, here also you can draw a parallel that you have people in your life that help you out every time you are in a tough situation. All right. So in the end, Ahluwalia said climbing the mountain was a worthwhile experience. The conquest of the internal summit is equally worthwhile. The internal summits are perhaps higher than Everest. Okay, so despite all the challenges you face while climbing a mountain, and at times you might feel like, why am I even doing this? What is the purpose of actually doing this? Mr. Ahluwalia says that once you reach the summit, you realize that it is a worthwhile experience. It teaches you a lot of things about yourself physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and it changes you as a person. So it's like a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But then he also says that the conquest of the internal summit is equally worthwhile. So in your life, if you're able to get a better understanding of yourself, if you're able to understand truly who you are, what you want, and how you can have a better attitude towards life, then that is equally worthwhile, and it's not easy. So the internal summits are perhaps higher than Everest. So it might be even more challenging to actually reach the summit of your own self, but like Mr. Ahluwalia pointed out, it is equally worthwhile. All right, so that sums up what the chapter is trying to tell us. And as you can see, today we'll be going over the chapter This is Jodi's Fawn. This is chapter 6 from your textbook Honeydew, and this is a story by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. Actually, this is a little part of a novel by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, and we are going to go over that little part that is in your textbook, and it's a very heartwarming story about Jodi and how he adopts a fawn. So without further ado, let's get right into part 1 of this chapter, which is the summary and analysis. Alright, no worries, Priya, welcome, hi. We haven't even started yet, so you're right on time. Okay, great. So before we get started with what actually happens in the story in the textbook, we need to know a little bit about what happens in the story in the novel. And your textbook quickly tells you in a couple of lines that our story begins right after Jodi's father had been bitten by a rattlesnake, and in order to save his life, he had to kill a doe. A doe is a female deer. I'm sure a lot of you know the song Doe, a deer, a female deer. So remember that, doe is a female deer. So he had to kill a doe in order to use the doe's liver to suck out the poison of the rattlesnake. Now the story is very old, and back in those days people used to think that a deer's liver can actually suck out the poison from a snake. Now we know scientifically that that's not really accurate, but at that time that's what people did. And so after Jodi's father did that, obviously the doe unfortunately died. And what was left behind was the doe's little baby, which is the fawn. So a fawn is a baby deer. Doe is a female deer, fawn is a baby deer. Alright, so now we know that Jodi's father had to kill a doe in order to save his own life. Jodi was watching all of this happen, and then Jodi felt really bad for the little orphaned fawn, or the fawn who lost his mother. Alright, so let's get right to it. Okay, so our story in the textbook begins with Jodi thinking constantly about the poor little fawn. The fawn kept coming in his thoughts and his dreams, and he felt really, really bad for the fawn. Okay, so he felt dejected, okay, extremely sad for killing the fawn's mother, right? And so Jodi decides to get up, go to his father who was laying in bed recovering, and he wanted to ask his father whether he could go back to the forest and get that fawn. So Jodi tried to convince his father that they should adopt the fawn because it's the right thing to do, because the fawn is without his mother because of them. It was because of Jodi and his father that the fawn lost his mother, right? So it's only the right thing to go and help the fawn. So Jodi's father had no argument for this. He agreed with Jodi. He said, what you're saying makes sense, and I don't know how to say no to you. So I am convinced you can go tell your mother that I have given you permission to go get the fawn. Alright. So then Jodi, after convincing his father, telling him how it's their responsibility to take care of the fawn, goes to his mother and sort of says the same thing. And over there, the doctor that was sitting there with his mother agrees with Jodi and says that yes, nothing in this world ever comes for free. Okay, which means that you, because the doe lost her life to save Jodi's father, it is now your responsibility to pay it back and help the little fawn that lost his mother, right? Okay, so Jodi's mother is initially not convinced. She says, no, I'm not so sure about this, and are you sure that you can sacrifice your own milk to feed that little animal? Because that's all we have to feed it. And Jodi says, yes, I'll give the fawn the milk that is meant for me, no problem. And Jodi is convinced to go and get the fawn back. So he asks Millwheel, this character, Millwheel, for help. And Millwheel says, yes, I'll take Jody into the forest and we can quickly go and find the fawn. So Jody sits on Millwheel's horse and they both go into the dense forest to find the little fawn. Yes, Jody is a good boy. Rightfully. Very good, Rashmi. Okay. So Jody promises his mother that he will feed the fawn his portion of milk. So Jody is sacrificing his own milk for the fawn. And Jody also promised his mother that he would return home soon. So Jody made 2 promises to his mother. And Millwheel and Jody set off to find the horse. Now here you can see a little dialogue. Do you think the fawn's still there? Will you help me find him? This is Jody asking Millwheel. And Millwheel says, we'll find him if he's alive. How you know it's a he? Okay, and then Jody says, the spots were all in a line. On a doe fawn, Pa says the spots are every which way. What does that mean? It means that Jody knew that the little fawn that was left behind was a male and not a female, because in a doe fawn or a female fawn, the spots are all anywhere, right? They're not in a particular pattern or an order, but on a male fawn, the spots are all in a line. Okay, now this is how Jody knows that the fawn was a male. Alright, so we're done with part 1 of the story. If you have any doubts along the way, please leave your doubts in the comments and we'll get to them right away. So far, so good. Good afternoon, Mayank. And now we have reached part 2 of the summary. Great, Gungun. Okay, so Millwheel and Jody then arrived at the forest. Okay, and they reached the spot where Jody's father had been bitten by the snake. Now, at this point, Jody did not want Millwheel to come with him and look for the fawn. Okay, and there were 2 reasons for this. What were the 2 reasons that Jody did not want Millwheel to accompany him? One reason was that if Jody was not able to find the fawn, Jody would have become very, very sad, and he did not want Millwheel to know that he was sad. So he did not want Millwheel to see how sad he would have felt had he not found the fawn. That's number 1. Reason number 2 is, if Jody did find the fawn, Jody would have been extremely happy, and this would have been a very special moment for Jody and the fawn. And so this was such a special secret moment that he did not want to share it with Millwheel. He wanted it all for himself. So the 2 reasons why Jody wanted Millwheel to go away was because if he got too sad after not finding the fawn, he did not want Millwheel to be there. Or if he got very, very happy after finding the fawn, he did not want Millwheel to be there. Okay. So Jody at this point makes up a reason and says, okay, you know what, I'll continue. I don't think the horse can go through this path, so why don't you leave me here? And after a little bit of hesitation, Millwheel says, okay, but just try to be safe. Don't get bitten by a snake yourself. And Jody says, yes, I'm all good. And Jody continues the journey by himself, right? And so once he began searching for the fawn, the first thing he actually ended up finding was the dead body of the doe. Okay, and because the incident of killing the doe had happened 1 day ago, at this point the doe was being, there were a bunch of birds that are called buzzards, and buzzards are these birds that are like vultures. So there are some birds that actually eat animals, right? They're called birds of prey. So they eat small animals, or sometimes even the carcass or dead bodies of larger animals. So buzzards are such birds, and they were all around the doe's body and they were feeding on it. And so at this point, Jody took out his bow, which is a trunk of or a large branch of a tree, and he used the bow to scare the buzzards away, and he went through there in search of the fawn. Okay, but he was not able to find the fawn anywhere over there, right? So then here we end part 2 of the story with Jody being unable to find the fawn. He just sees the carcass of the doe, he sees buzzards, he sees the paw prints of huge cats that were probably there, but he's not able to find the fawn. Then we move on to part 3 of the story. So we've already covered 2 parts. I hope it's all good to go so far. And alright, so coming to part 3, now Jody sensed some movement in front of him and got startled, and then he realized that the little fawn is right in front of him. The fawn looked at Jody, Jody looked at the fawn, and Jody was being extremely careful so as to not startle or scare the fawn away. So he gently stroked the sides, and how it's described in the book is he touched the fawn or stroked the fawn as if the fawn was a china deer. Now, what does that mean? You know, sometimes you'll find plates and cups. Maybe a lot of you have these in your houses as well that your parents say are china. What that means is they are made of a particular kind of clay and they're very delicate, so they can break easily. Okay, so Jody treated the deer as if it was also a china deer. That means it was a very delicate deer. Okay, and so just like that, he slowly stroked the fawn's neck, and this made Jody delirious. So Jody got very, very happy at this point. And why was he happy? It's because when he was touching the fawn was not running away. The fawn probably recognized Jody and was happy to see Jody. And yes, Rashmi says it right there, Chini Mitti. Great connection that you made there. So yeah, because your cups and saucers and plates that are made that are china, that are made with Chini Mitti, can break very easily. That's why the author is making this comparison, that you handle things that can break easily with a lot of care. So Jody was handling the fawn with a lot of care. And once the fawn did not get scared, Jody got very, very happy and used this opportunity to pick up the little fawn and started taking him home. Okay, so Jody was afraid that the fawn might kick or bleat. What is bleat? Bleating is the sound that these animals make, a deer, a goat, a sheep, right? So Jody was scared that the fawn might kick or bleat at the sight or smell of his mother. So like I told you, when Jody went out looking for the fawn, the dead body of the fawn's mother, the doe, was right there. So Jody was scared that the fawn might not like it and will obviously kick, bleat and get angry and stressed if he saw his mother. So Jody quickly took the fawn away from that area and finally shielded the little fawn, carried him very carefully, and finally made his way to the road that went to his house. Right? So in the journey, Jody a lot of times got breathless. He got tired. He had to put the fawn down. But he was taking these small breaks, but he was very happy about finding the fawn and taking the fawn home. All right. Okay. Sorry, Radhika. I will remember that your name is Radhika and not Rashmi. And yes, Gungun rightly put it, Jody loved the fawn. Okay. And then finally, Jody protected the fawn's face from the thorns and bushes all around, took it home and went right to his spa and showed his father, who was very, very happy to see that Jody finally found the fawn. And you can see that in the pictures over here. Pa, look! And I'm glad you found him. And then finally, as promised, Jody went to the kitchen, took his share of the milk and started feeding it to the fawn. Okay, and what Jody did was he dipped his fingers into the milk and let the fawn suck on it. And every time he took his fingers away, the fawn would start bleating because it wanted more. And Jody kept feeding the fawn and he thrust his fingers into the fawn's soft, wet mouth, and the fawn sucked greedily. Okay, and then we can see towards the end that Jody and the fawn developed a relationship of love and trust, and Jody really took care of the fawn. So let's get acquainted, or let's get to know the characters first. And now these are not just characters in a story, these are actually real people. Firdaus Kanga is an Indian writer and a journalist. Okay, so I just told you about his travel book, Heaven on Wheels, in which he describes his experiences at his travel throughout the United Kingdom, especially his visit to Cambridge. Now, Cambridge is a city in England which is also famous for because it is home to a very prestigious university, which is University of Cambridge, right? It is one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and people like Isaac Newton have actually taught there, and so has Stephen Hawking, right? We'll get to know a bit about him also, but first, coming to Firdaus Kanga. So now Firdaus Kanga was born in Bombay, and he was actually born with a defect, a disease which is known as brittle bone disease, in which your bones don't become strong, and so they cannot support your body and are always at a risk of breaking. And so people with this disease are wheelchair bound. They unfortunately have to spend their lives on a wheelchair. So it leads to a disability. Okay, and after this, let's quickly learn a bit about Stephen Hawking. I'm sure a lot of you already know who Stephen Hawking is. So Stephen Hawking was one of the greatest scientific minds of this era, often compared to Einstein or Newton. Stephen Hawking was very well known and recognized in the field of astrophysics. He wrote a best-selling book called A Brief History of Time, and he was one of the most well-respected scientists in the world, right? And one thing to note about Stephen Hawking here, and which we also noted about Firdaus Kanga, is that both are wheelchair bound. Stephen Hawking actually passed away quite recently in 2018, and he spent his entire life on a wheelchair due to a disease he had, because of which his muscles eventually stopped working. So he lost all voluntary muscle control and was completely paralyzed. And the way Stephen Hawking communicated with people was through a machine. So he had a machine, he used his finger to kind of indicate to the machine what he wants to say, and the machine would say it for him. And this was obviously a very long and stressful process, right? If you're trying to have a conversation and if you have to wait for someone to punch in the letters of what they need to say, obviously the conversation is not going to be very elaborate. It's going to be short. Not a lot of things are going to be said. You're going to be to the point, which can get very frustrating when you have a mind like Stephen Hawking's and you have so much knowledge, you have so much to share, right? Okay, so now that we are well acquainted with the people in our chapter, let's get right to it. Okay, it was on a walking tour through Cambridge that the guide mentioned Stephen Hawking. Poor man who is quite disabled now, though he is a worthy successor to Isaac Newton, whose chair he has at the university. Right? So this is what our author Firdaus Kanga heard on his tour in Cambridge, and that's when he realized, oh, Cambridge is where Stephen Hawking lives, and of course, now that I'm here, I must meet him. All right? So what does Firdaus Kanga do at this point? As soon as he realizes that he should not let go of this opportunity, he calls up his home and asks his assistant if he can have an appointment with Stephen Hawking. And the assistant says, yes, but only for half an hour. So Firdaus Kanga gets a half an hour slot with Stephen Hawking, and obviously he's super excited, also a little nervous. And how the author convinces the assistant to meet Stephen Hawking is he says that I have come on a wheelchair all the way from India, right? So he indicates that he wished to write a book based on his travels in England, and that's why he wanted to meet Stephen Hawking. And after getting a meeting, he got super excited, surprised, nervous, all these emotions at the same time, and composed himself. All right, so then what happened next? So the author goes to Stephen Hawking's house the next day, meets him there, and is surprised that such a brilliant astrophysicist who has contributed so much in the field of physics is actually paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. And that is a similarity between the two. So you see that both of them, although suffering from different diseases, are bound to a wheelchair, right? So now Firdaus Kanga composes himself and he starts asking a few questions to Mr. Hawking. So at first he asked Mr. Hawking, and now this is also an assumption that we are making. We don't actually know the first question that the author asked, but we know the reply that Stephen Hawking gave, right? So Stephen Hawking says that he is not brave, and he is just accepting his current situation, right? So from this we can assume that the first question that Firdaus Kanga asked Stephen Hawking was that, how are you so brave and courageous, and despite your disability, how have you bravely done all of this and achieved so much, right? So this will be a question that will come in later, which is why I'm pointing out to you that when you read the chapter, you will see that it jumps straight from Firdaus Kanga thinking about his own life experiences straight to the answer that Stephen Hawking gave him. He never mentions the first question that he actually asked. But we can assume, because Stephen Hawking said that I am not brave, it's just that I don't have a choice. I have no other choice. So because that's the response he gives, we can assume that the first question the author asked was, how are you so brave, right? Okay. If you have any doubts along the way, feel free to stop me and ask doubts about the chapter. All right. So here, Firdaus Kanga asked, a lot of people seem to think that disabled people are chronically unhappy. I said, I know that's not true myself. Are you often laughing inside? So here what's going on? Firdaus Kanga is saying, people, when you talk about disabled people, you automatically think that they must be leading a very sad life, a very difficult life, and you think that they're always unhappy. But Firdaus Kanga, as a disabled person himself, said that that is not true. I am often happy. Do you also feel the same way? Are you laughing on the inside? To which Stephen Hawking replied, I find it amusing when people patronize me. So what does that mean? Patronizing is when someone seems like is very nice towards you and is speaking kindly with you, but is actually speaking out of superiority, right? So when someone makes you feel inferior despite sounding nice and sweet, that means they are being patronizing. So one thing that Stephen Hawking found amusing was that when people patronized him, so instead of getting angry about it, he found it amusing. That because now here's something that we all need to realize. Obviously, if there is somebody who's differently abled in the chat, do let me know. But a lot of us are not. We are the majority. And as people who have not suffered a disability, we do not know what differently abled people actually go through, right? So we sometimes might have a lot of questions that we want to ask out of curiosity, but those questions can sound rude and mean and impolite and also inconsiderate. So we should avoid talking in a way that is inconsiderate. Another thing we should avoid is feel that we are superior and assume that somebody who's differently able will not be able to do this or that. It's okay to help somebody, but to feel that I need to help them because they are incapable of doing something is also wrong. We should always deal very sensitively with people who are differently able. We need to talk to them, communicate with them, understand what their situation is, and treat them like any other fellow human being, right? We're all human beings. and that's how we should all treat each other. All right, so be mindful of this all the time, even when you're talking here on the chat. All right, so now when here at this point Firdaus Kanga asked all of these, he had a lot of questions to ask, right? He really looked up to Stephen Hawking, and whenever we meet someone famous or someone that we've looked up to, obviously we get a little flustered and we want to know a lot of things. So just like any other person, Firdaus Kanga wanted to know a lot of things about Stephen Hawking. But Stephen Hawking had to make a lot of effort to actually reply to him, right? He couldn't just say it. He was paralyzed all over. So he had to use a machine in which he individually punched all the letters of the sentence that he wanted to say, and that took some time. So because it took all this time, the author actually felt guilty of making the scientist speak, because it took a lot of effort for him to tap on the switch and find the right words on his computer, right? So he was a man with a bright mind. Obviously everyone knew this, but the computerized voice of Stephen Hawking made his thoughts come out as frozen phrases. So have you ever heard a robot talk, or sometimes you have things like Siri and OK Google on your phone, and when you make them talk, it's a very robotic voice. There's no inflection. When we talk to each other as human beings, we express our emotions through our tone, right? If our voice is going high pitch, if it's coming low, all of that indicates certain emotions to the other person. Now with Stephen Hawking, everything he said was coming out through a machine voice, a robotic voice. So it was very hard for the author to make out what the tone or the intention was when all of these things were coming. Yes, Alexa too, right? So what the Stephen Hawking's machine voice kind of sounded like Alexa and OK Google and all of these things. All right. So, and do you find it annoying when someone like me comes and disturbs you in your work? This is a question that Firdaus Kanga asked Mr. Hawking. Mr. Hawking says, yes. Okay, now this, you might read this and you might think, what a rude response. It's not actually a rude response, because right after making this response, what did Mr. Hawking do? Mr. Hawking gave a slight smile, right? And when he smiled, that's when Firdaus Kanga realized that he was a man with a beautiful heart and soul. Now here's a fun fact. This is not given in your chapter, but if you research a little bit about Stephen Hawking, watch his interviews, you'll realize that he really had a great sense of humor, and he liked making these witty remarks. And so as Mayank has rightly pointed out, he said it in a funny way, not a rude way. And how we got to know that is because he smiled right after saying it. Okay? All right. So the writer then gives a description of Hawking's as to how he looks like a three-dimensional version of all his photographs in magazines. The first impression of his appearance is shocking, but he's the embodiment of inner glow in a man. Okay, so as our author is looking at Stephen Hawking and understanding different things about him, he says that, because he can't move his body. When you meet a person in real life where we're moving our hands, we're moving parts of our body, right? He couldn't do that. So he literally looked like his photograph, just a 3D version of it. But the more he interacted with him, the more he saw the glow inside of him, right? Okay, now let's read this. Then you see the head twisted sideways into a slump, the torso shrunk inside the pale blue shirt, the wasted legs. You look at his eyes, which can speak still, and they are saying something huge and urgent. It is hard to tell what. But you are shaken because you have seen something you never thought could be seen. Before you, like a lantern whose walls are worn so thin you glimpse only the light inside, is the incandescence of a man. The body, almost irrelevant, exists only like a case made of shadows, so that I, no believer in eternal souls, know that this is what each of us is. Everything else an accessory. Okay, this is a very beautiful description. Here, two words that we need to understand. Incandescence means inner glow or light. Okay, and accessory means something that is not essential, it's just extra. So after interacting with Mr. Hawking, the author realized that when you look at his body, which is not supporting him at all, it's completely paralyzed. You see beyond it and you see the inner light of a person, and then you realize that is what's important. The body is just a shell, a case of shadows, an accessory, and what is inside is what really has the substance. This is what our author realized after interacting with Mr. Hawking. Now, here Firdaus Kanga asks, what do you think is the best thing about being disabled? And Mr. Hawking says, I don't think there is anything good about being disabled. So there was no extra positivity here. Mr. Hawking straight away said, I don't think there's anything good about being disabled. And in the beginning also he said that it was not brave of him that he was living his life and achieving all these things. It's just that he had no other choice. So this gives us the mindset or what Mr. Hawking thought about being disabled. Now, I think you do discover how much kindness there is in the world. Yes. So, Firdaus Kanga adds, so after asking what do you think is a good thing about being disabled, Stephen Hawking says nothing. Firdaus Kanga kind of adds that, one good thing that there is that you discover the kindness in people. You see how kind people can be. And Stephen Hawking replies with a yes. But because the yes came in that same robot machine voice, there was no way for our author to kind of understand how much Stephen Hawking agreed with him. If I agree with you very emphatically, I would say yes, absolutely. And if I don't really agree with you, I would say yes, right? So there was no way of telling what Stephen Hawking meant because of the machine voice, right? Now, when your body is a claustrophobic room and the walls are growing narrower day by day, it doesn't do much good to know that there are people outside smiling with admiration to see you breathing still. Okay, here what does claustrophobic mean? Claustrophobic means when you, it's basically, claustrophobia is a kind of a fear of small places, narrow places, enclosed spaces, and feeling claustrophobic is feeling suffocated, right? So when your body is in a claustrophobic room, why he's describing it like this is because Stephen Hawking's body did not really support him, okay, did nothing for him. So it was a claustrophobic room and the walls are growing narrower day by day. So it's not like it's getting better, it's getting worse day by day. Then it doesn't do much good to know that there are people outside smiling. Then it doesn't really matter much to you that people look up to you or think that, wow, you're so brave and so courageous, right? So this realization, what is on your screen right now, the author has, after he asks Mr. Stephen Hawking, that has knowing that he's an inspiration to other people helped him, and to this Mr. Stephen Hawking said no, right? So the reason why Stephen Hawking said no when the author asked if being an inspiration helps you is this. This is the reason that our author thinks, okay? So it's important for you to remember the author's point of view as well and not just the conversation that they both had, all right? So then Stephen Hawking says that the only advice he would give to differently able people is to focus on things that they are good at. And after hearing this, the author suddenly gets reminded of a time where he tried learning how to play the Spanish guitar, and because the guitar was so big, he couldn't really manage to do it, and he was happy the day he unstrung it or broke the guitar, right? And after this conversation, a very insightful conversation, the half an hour came to an end. And at this point, it was time for our author to leave. But as soon as he got up to leave, Stephen Hawking actually stopped him and said, wait, why don't you have some tea and I will take you around my garden. And this was actually a very, very happy moment for our author because he got to spend more time. He was already nervous about spending the half an hour, and it obviously took longer for Stephen Hawking to respond to everything that the author was asking. So he was very happy that he got to spend more time. Stephen Hawking took him around his garden, which was huge. It was like a park. There was not much conversation that happened at that time, but it was time well spent nonetheless. And then he looked back after his time with Stephen Hawking was over and realized that he had just met the embodiment of his bravest self. What that means is that he felt inspired, he felt happy, and he felt that this is who I want to become. And so it gave him motivation to grow. Just like, sometimes you meet someone who's very inspirational, you feel like, I need to work harder to become like that person. This is how our author felt after meeting Stephen Hawking, right? So Ruskin Bond, as you know, loved the hill stations. All his stories revolved usually around hill stations. And right now in this chapter, we will be seeing a snippet of what monsoon looked like in Missouri. All right. Now this chapter is very visual. And when you read it, you will realize that you can imagine everything really well because it uses imagery very well. It describes everything that you can see very, very well. So let's try to get a hang of that and go through the summary and analysis. Now, obviously, because we're following the monsoon, we start somewhere around June and end in March. Okay, so in the beginning, how does the monsoon begin? It begins with mist. So Ruskin Bond writes that on 24th June, the first day of monsoon mist can be seen. And he expresses how the mist affects everything around it and makes everything melancholy. What does melancholy mean? Melancholy means sad. So the mist kind of brings this air of sadness around, not in a very depressing sense, but just the general vibe of the area becomes a little sad, not excited like when it's sunny. Okay? And then the mist covers and surrounds everything. So you can't see the hills, you can't see the birds anymore. In fact, Ruskin Bond says that he could hear Biju calling out to his sister, but he could not see him because even Biju was concealed or hidden because of the mist, right? And the two things to note here, the two changes that the mist actually brings is that first, you cannot see the hills, and second, you cannot hear the birds. All right, then we move on to the next day, which is 25th June, and on 25th June, it actually starts raining. But the rain is warm and it's not cold like the winter rain. Okay, and the air around becomes humid. Now this is when flowers start blooming and you see the first sign of the beginning of monsoon, which is the cobra lily that rears its head from the ferns. Okay, and you have all the definitions of different animals, plants and difficult words in your textbook, so make sure you take a look at all of those definitions. So what marks the beginning of monsoon? It's the cobra lily rearing its head. And then Ruskin Bond goes ahead and describes the place during monsoon as a paradise that might have been. So paradise means heaven, means a very, very beautiful place. And so this place is so beautiful, especially during the monsoon, that it could have been a paradise. All right, and then we move on to the next day, which is 27th June. And on 27th June, we can see different kind of animals appearing. So we have leeches because of the rains. Then we also have a leopard who steals a dog. And then we have minivets, which are birds, brightly colored birds sitting on the trees. And they sit very quietly on the trees. And we have drongos coming in. All right, so all these different animals make an appearance marking the beginning or the onset of monsoon. Okay, and this is where we move on to August. All right, now in August, Ruskin Bond describes that it's raining a lot, obviously because monsoon has begun and now it's in full throttle mode. So Ruskin Bond says that on 2nd August all night the rain has been drumming on the corrugated tin roof. Now this word corrugated, what does it mean? Corrugated means like this. So it has a lot of, let me draw it out for you. So you must have seen tin roofs that look like this. So these are corrugated tin roofs. All right. And so because they are made out of tin, Ruskin Bond says that you could hear the rain fall very loudly. Okay, and those of you who've experienced this might be able to relate that you can hear the rain fall very loudly, almost as if it's falling directly onto your head. But that's not really happening. It's not reaching you because the roof still protects you. And this gives Ruskin Bond the feeling of being touched yet untouched by rain. Touched because it's so loud and right above you and you can hear it and it's almost hitting you, but untouched because you're still not getting wet. All right. And then we move on to the next day, which is August 3, where it stopped raining for some time. And we can all relate to how beautifully written this is because sometimes when it rains for endless days, it gets a little depressing. And then suddenly when there is sunlight, we really relish or enjoy that sunlight. So that's what the people did as well. When on 3rd August it stopped raining for a little bit, there were hints of sunlight and you could see people going out and doing a lot of different things, like a woman chopping some sticks, and he could hear the tinkling of cowbells as well. And the author noticed, Ruskin Bond noticed, that a lot of small animals had also come out to soak in all of that sunlight. And he was also very pleasantly surprised to finally hear a bird, because what happened as monsoon began, the birds became quiet. So he was surprised on this day to hear a bird whistling from the depths of the ravine or the valley. All right, then we move on to 12th August, where it again starts raining non-stop. And he says that it has been raining more than a week. Everything around becomes damp, it becomes soggy. You feel like you're wet even though you're not wet. But the beautiful part is that because of this rain, there are flowers everywhere. So hills are covered with flowers, and not a lot of people go out in the rain. People like going out when it's nice and sunny outside. Not a lot of people go out in the rain. So Ruskin Bond said that he could see a few umbrellas bobbing around. And you need to notice how nicely he has explained everything so that you can directly visualize it. Instead of saying that people went out with their umbrellas, he's saying you could see a few umbrellas bobbing around. And although it wasn't cold, yet the rain brought a vibrant and lush appearance to the late monsoon flowers and the different kind of flowers that he's talked about, like balsam, dahlias, begonias, ground orchids. Okay, these are all different kinds of flowers. So because of the full throttle monsoon, all these flowers were really flourishing and you could see them all around. All right, then we move on to August 31st. Now on 31st August, you see that monsoon growth has happened everywhere. Okay, and that means that after these regular heavy rains, the plants have really thrived and you could see that around. And you could also see that the cobra lily that we talked about in the beginning, that was rearing its head to indicate or tell us that monsoon has started, its seeds are now turning red. So it's the cobra lily through which we can tell the beginning and the end of monsoon, because when the cobra lily's seeds turn red, that indicates that the monsoon, after reaching its peak, is now coming to an end. And snakes and rodents that live in little holes everywhere, they have been forced to come out because their homes are now filled with all this water. In fact, you could see a particular animal called a shrew come out and amuse a bunch of children, and then those children get scolded by their grandmother saying ki chuchundar ko nahi manna hai because it's lucky. So a shrew is a chuchundar, it's a small rodent, and they are considered lucky. They bring prosperity and money. And funnily enough, right after that, Ruskin Bond receives a check, even though the check is not a big amount, but welcome all the same, as he says. This is a little humorous bit that he has added in his diary. And then we move on from August to October. It's the 3rd of October. And here the author observes that the monsoon this year has been much longer than previous monsoon. So the monsoon usually ends ends by the end of August, but this time, even in October, it went on till a longer time. And now in October, the winter rain has begun. So he had described the monsoon rain before, saying that it's warm and humid but not cold like the winter rain. So now if the winter rain has begun, that means the rain is cold. And then on 26th January, the author wrote a poem about this winter rain. And he also said that the winter rain made him feel lonely. He had a friend over, and after that friend left, he was just alone with his thoughts. And he also says that, you know, how the monsoon rains brought so many beautiful flowers along with it. There are no flowers that come with the winter rain. All right, so now we've gone from monsoon to winter. That brings us to March, which is the end of winter. So this is now late March, end of winter, first two sentences. And Ruskin Bond observes that the blackest cloud that he's ever seen appears, and there's a hailstorm. And so the hail falls like little marbles. If you've ever experienced a hailstorm, you see if you go out and when the hail falls, it actually hurts, right? So they fall like little marbles, and there's nothing like a hailstorm to clear the sky, because after this dark black rain cloud and this heavy hailstorm, the sky clears and Ruskin Bond even sees a hint of a rainbow. Okay, and that is the end of our chapter.